In this set of materials, we're going to be specifically thinking about the concept of worldview. And we want to give an introduction to worldview as an overall concept because it's really very important for us as we evaluate life for ourselves and also as we try to grapple with the meaning of life in the ways that other people in other cultures and situations evaluate life for themselves. So we're going to reference the idea of worldview back to the notion of God's big story because He is the one who describes the essence of our world for us, and that's what we, particularly as Christian theists, believe. So we're going to talk about how worldview relates to God's story. Now there's a lot of material that we'll need to cover in this discussion of worldview, and so we're going to give at least, hopefully, a good introduction in these tutorials, thinking about the fact that as God's story is given, that also other worldviews are formed by human beings, lots of people in this world not believing in the way that God has revealed His story. And so how then are their worldviews being formed? Why are they being formed? What are they based upon if not God's story? We'll describe and define also what worldview actually is, give a definition, and talk about worldview as a concept. Now that definition will come from others who are writing and thinking about these things, because we're certainly not the only ones who are thinking and talking about worldview, and so we'll rely on other resources as well that will help us to think well. And then we will also look at specific examples of worldviews and describe primary features of those. Now there are a lot of shades and varieties of worldview as a concept. We know that there are 7 billion people in the world today, maybe more, and if you were to ask each of those individuals to tell you their story or to give their account of the world to you, their stories would each be different in various ways. So we're not trying to suggest that we can reduce everyone's view down to these 8 categories or 10 categories or 12 categories even that we're talking about. We're not trying to be overly simplistic, but we do want to suggest that we can come to conclude that there are a set of categories that tend to cover the majority of the ways that people handle and think about the meaning of their life and their existence. So we want to present a number of examples of worldview and describe those core features in the process of creating a set of categories that we can work from. And then we want to give also a picture of a worldview model or a framework in a way that will help us to understand how to visually encapsulate the idea of worldview in a way that fits with our particular goals and objectives for the program that we're involved in. Also, we want to have enough information to think about it and evaluate the worldviews around us. We believe that the best starting point for doing that, to be able to evaluate the worldviews of others, is to be able to first evaluate our own worldviews, to reflect critically on the assumptions that we hold to, and then to in turn see how those are played out in our own lives and our own behavior. And so as we need to critically reflect on what our worldview assumptions are, then we can apply that critical reflection to others in the world around us as well. We want to consider what it is that motivates change in worldview. Now, we of course are very interested in this concept because we as Christian theists and as people who talk about seeing others evaluate their worldviews, we want them to have that reflection to be able to come to an understanding of God's plan and His story, who He is, and what He wants them to know about His view of things, and to know Him as the real, true definition of reality. Then we're going to need to understand how worldviews change. We want to see change in a situation, and so it's a really important concept for us, and we want to understand what God intends in the process of that worldview change, what it's going to take for worldview to shift in that kind of foundational and fundamental way. And so that's the overall direction we will be heading in this set of the 4 tutorials that we have on worldview. So I have before me a picture of a sculpture made by Rodin in 1902 that's called The Thinker. It's a portrait of a person sitting on a stump or a rock, perhaps, with an elbow on a knee and a fist under a chin. And when we as human beings see a portrait like that, we can relate to that picture. We look at a person who's being described in the pose of a contemplator, a thinker, and we say, yes, we understand, we relate to that picture of a human being considering, thinking through, evaluating aspects of life and existence. Contemplating the meaning of life. That's something that we relate closely to and well to. And so one of the underlying or foundational questions that we ask in the discussion of worldview is, why is it that we pursue an understanding of meaning in the first place? You know, as I've experienced life around the world, I've seen that human beings do indeed grapple with a fairly common standard set of issues, a very similar set of questions about the meaning and the nature of existence. The questions do indeed come up time and time again. So if you go from one culture to another, to another, to another, and you try to understand the way that each group of those people is interpreting their reality, you begin to see that they're grappling with some very basic questions about the meaning of existence and the meaning of life itself. Now we're going to try to grapple with some of those questions and try to describe ways that we can think of common questions that would be asked around the world. We look at a picture like this picture of the thinker. Now let's look at another slide. A picture of a chimpanzee or an orangutan who's sitting in a pose in some ways similar to the thinker, with his legs crossed, his hands folded, a hand under a chin as well. You know, when I show these pictures to my young children and they saw the picture of the statue of the thinker, didn't get much of a response from them, apart from the fact that they relate to this individual as a human being who's thinking. But when they see this picture of a chimpanzee or an orangutan looking as if he is also contemplating with his hand under his chin and looking forward, they instinctively chuckle at that. And we do too. We think of that as humorous because we see a chimpanzee, a non-human, striking a similar pose to a human being as a thinker. And for naturalists, for those who believe in the material world only, with no transcendent presence, in other words, there's no one who's able to speak into the material box of existence in which we as human beings live, that this chimpanzee with his hand under his chin, looking like he's thinking, that in their mindset at least, that he's a being who's in the process of becoming a self-conscious thinker. We instinctively, though, as human beings know that when we see those two pictures, we're not describing the same thing. We have to come to those pictures with a certain presupposition. We have to presume something in order to even contemplate the idea of thinking about worldview. Because we have to be able to explain ultimately the difference between the chimpanzee with his hand on his chin in his hand, supposedly thinking, and then the thinker, who's the human being, who's legitimately contemplating his existence. Now, in some worldviews, the starting point for answering that very basic question, what is the difference between a thinking human being contemplating the meaning of life and a chimpanzee who looks like he's contemplating? They're very different presuppositions or starting points. It's very difficult for some worldviews to answer the question about the differences between those two poses from different beings, because the presuppositions that underpin their worldview don't provide a substantial basis for resolving that kind of question about the act or the ability that human beings have to contemplate the difference in their lives, their self-awareness versus the life of an animal who doesn't have that same level of understanding or awareness. Now, of course, as Christians, we have some thoughts about that. These are things that we, in these tutorials, want to describe or introduce in greater detail so that we can begin to think about them for ourselves in our conversations together. Now, there's a natural tendency that human beings have that we're proposing here to deal worldviewishly, to think worldviewishly, to live in terms of worldview, in descriptions of meaning for existence. For example, if we look at a painting, an interesting painting by Winslow Homer in the 1890s called The Gulf Stream, we see that as we, humanly speaking, express ourselves artistically or creatively, we do indeed tend to demonstrate the inner working of our core allegiances or commitments, that we manifest something of our souls in the process of those artistic endeavors. And so in this painting, Winslow Homer is depicting an ocean scene. The Gulf Stream was something that he would have been very familiar with as in his particular genre of painting. And we can see a number of different objects in that painting that do indeed catch our attention. There are 5 or 6, I think for me, that capture the nature of this painting. The first of those that we can see front and center is this broken down, relatively small boat with a broken mast and seemingly just drifting on the sea around it. Now the sea, as you notice, you look at this, it's not calm either. The water in the forefront there, you see as rough water, also quite a number of sharks. They, of course, wouldn't look particularly friendly either. And then the tinges of red that we can see around the boat in the water at least give the impression that there's blood. Now the man also who's in the boat, he's not well dressed. He only has a pair of pants on. He's a black person, and at this time in the American era where the painter would have been painting, that kind of individual would not have had a great future look or standing in society. And then we look in the background and we can see a water spout in the corner. That wouldn't be a welcome sign for a boat or a destructive power or force in the ocean with lots of power. And then in an interesting way up in the left-hand corner, we can see on the horizon, looking closely, intently at the painting, that in the clouds there's the shape of the shading of a mast of a ship that's very faint in the distance. And so when we put those components together and looking at this picture, we tend to see a grim picture. We don't see a happy outlook there. The point here for us in talking about this isn't to overvaluate the painting as if we're art critics, because I'm certainly not one. But the point is this, that we as human beings are artistic and creative beings who are expressing our souls. And so as Christian theists, we would say that we're creative beings because God Himself is creative, and that's a part of His identity. And so we as creative beings, in a sense, we exude worldview from the person that we are in our souls. And so in this painting, Winslow Homer is portraying a very grim worldview, and one that, even though it's grim, we certainly can see evidence that he is portraying something for us. When critics look at this kind of a painting, they see a portrayal of the world around us as a difficult place, that we are on a boat, in a sense, as humans, that's taking us in a direction that we're not clear about. There are lots of obstacles in the world. There are lots of dangers, lots of ways in which our lives may not end up positively. And so as we evaluate this kind of human creative process, as we read, as we watch movies, we see artistic expression demonstrating really core commitments or questions that manifest worldview. That's a natural occurrence for us as human beings. Human beings do that by definition of who they are, time and time again, that's occurring. And so one of the questions, as we've heard reiterated here, is we're asking, why do we do that? And then another question we're asking is, what is it that we're actually doing? What is actually demonstrated in the artistic and other forms of expression that are pointing us back to those underlying worldview commitments that we're making and suggesting in the way that we express ourselves? Worldview is something that we as human beings do, that we hold to, that helps us to explain the meaning of existence. Worldviews are descriptions of meaning in relationship to our existence as human beings. Now, there are two worldview resources that we'll be referring to during our 4 tutorials. One is a very helpful book by James Sire called The Universe Next Door, and the other is a similarly helpful book by Wilkins and Sanford that's called Hidden Worldviews, 8 Cultural Stories That Shape Our Lives. If you've read anything by James Sire, you would know that he's a Christian philosopher and apologist, and so in his book, he's describing worldview in a fairly formal and theoretical but descriptive way that's helpful. He does that so that he can deliberately contrast the large worldview systems with the worldview system of Christian theism, because his inclination and background is Christian theism. And so he includes in his book a description of traditional religious worldview systems. He also, in the process, gives a definition of worldview, and he outlines a set of 8 universal questions that we can ask to arrive at a description of any given worldview. Now, we can use these universal questions then to help us understand where another person stands in terms of their worldview and in what Sire considers to be very critical areas. And then also Sire is in the process of describing those large worldview systems. He's also explaining the strengths and the weaknesses of those worldviews, how they stand up or how they compare with our Christian theism. So we'll be looking at some of those universal questions later in these tutorials because they are helpful in explaining and describing worldview systems overall. Now, the second book is the one by Wilkins and Sanford that I've mentioned. It takes a much less formal approach. They're trying to describe worldviews that they think of as being lived worldviews, lived in. They don't go into comparative religion per se or comparative worldview systems such as comparing Islam and Christianity, which is what James Sire does. But they're describing the more subtle cultural influences that are shaping our lives. They look at the kinds of influences that our society and culture tend to generate in the course of culture creation, in a sense, as life changes for us, that shape the ways that we think and live day to day. So they're deliberately taking a less formal approach, but they're still in the process describing some very pertinent areas of worldview and worldview formation for us. They're describing it from a perspective, a very interesting perspective really, of the story that each of us lives out, the story that undergirds and supports our life and that our worldviews derive from and certainly connect to. And that's a really good concept for us in our discussion of worldview because it relates to some of what we think and talk about in terms of God's story and God's relationship to us and His story. We see the generation of story as an important category for our life experience. Now, hopefully, you will have an opportunity to look at these 2 books yourself. We'll be referring to them in the next 3 tutorials as we move ahead, but we won't be covering them exhaustively, just summarizing some parts. So it would be good for you to have an opportunity to read through them on your own. Now, we'll begin, as in both of these resources, they give a similar definition of worldview because they rely on that definition from James Sire's book. And so as we read that together, we want to think about this definition of worldview from James Sire. He says this. He says that worldview is a commitment. It's a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions, and he defines presuppositions as assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false, that we hold And again, qualifying that statement about us holding them, because at times we hold them consciously, at times subconsciously, sometimes consistently, sometimes inconsistently, about the basic constitution of reality. And that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. Now, I know that definition it's a mouthful. It's hard to take all in at once, and we're going to look at it in more detail. But we probably should first step back and look at the concept of a metanarrative. What is a metanarrative? If you talk about metanarrative in our postmodern, in essence, world today, the Western world, if you will, you'll run into a great deal of modern skepticism about the very notion of a metanarrative. We think of a metanarrative as an overarching story that people believe in, usually a group of people together, that helps to tie reality together for them, that fundamentally joins together the different aspects of their existence or their reality. We believe, and we're committed to the fact that worldviews are meta-narratives. They're commitments that people groups or peoples make at a heart level that are these overarching stories to tie reality together for us. Now, historically, over the course of the centuries, and particularly in recent times, we've seen a steady movement away from a belief in the explanatory power of metanarratives. Pre-moderns were very religious, by and large. They were skeptical, somewhat of scientific knowledge. And then we moved into a period of modernism where there was an explosion of industry, an understanding of science, and an amazing growth in the awareness of the intricate nature of God's creation. And then in the process of that, a growing belief that science was able to provide those answers that we needed for life. And then there was an increasing skepticism about science's ability to provide those answers in the World War eras and after that. And so this movement towards what we think of as postmodernism in simplistic terms, which is a belief in a relative view of truth, that there is no ultimate meta-narrative that describes and holds reality together. So we've seen that there's been a shift from what we've described as a concrete belief in religious or spiritual concepts to a belief in science and naturalism to provide answers, and then to a skepticism about either system being able to provide a meta-narrative that ultimately describes reality adequately. And all that to say that we will run into people today who are very skeptical about meta-narratives. In worldview terms, truth is we can describe even that skeptical position as a type of a meta-narrative, that there's a vicious cycle that some postmodern thinkers get themselves into of criticizing and critiquing, and that becomes a type of a story, one of our stories, if you will, as human beings, and in contrast to the meta-narrative of God's story. So we have lots of meta-narratives that define our stories, and then we have the ultimate meta-narrative, the real reality that defines what God's story is. And so as we think that through, as we begin to process what meta-narratives are and how they relate to worldview, those overarching stories of reality, we should return to James Sire's definition then and unpack the components of it a little bit, because it becomes an important reference point for us. And so he begins his definition by saying that worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart. And he's choosing the word heart very carefully because the biblical concept of the heart takes in the whole of a human person. That we're talking about orientations of the core of who we are, that they're commitments that could be, as he says, expressed as stories, that each of us has a story, and our stories very much connect to the way that we see the worldview our worldview being generated or unfolding. If I were to describe my entire life story to you, for example, you would look at my story and find that my story gives you a good understanding of of the nexus or connection point between my metanarrative process in development, or my worldview process in development, and how my story connects to what that worldview that I hold to, what those presuppositions are actually about. You could find the elements of my worldview built into, running concurrently in a sense with the story of my life. Now, the orientation of our hearts, as James Sire says here, is it's based on a story of some kind, because our lives are lived out in history, in narrative format. That's the nature of human existence. And often, if worldviews are formalized, those stories can be defined, as he indicates here, as a set of presuppositions, as assumptions that are summary statements of those core commitments that I have made as a human being about, in my case, about who God is, about God in His nature, because I believe in a triune, personal, transcendent God who's created all things, has love and care for all that He has created, and He has a personal relationship with what He's created. Now, those would be presuppositions I would hold to that would be the basis of me operating as a Christian theist. Those presuppositions we've stated, but it's worth continually reiterating that they're almost always derived from life experience in the form of a story. That my story as a human being, me as a person connected to the overarching story that's God's. God has established a story for us in His Word, and our lives can or may not be connected to that, but in my case as a Christian theist, that's certainly the case. And some of us, James Sire describes here as well, that some of us hold to our core commitments more or less consistently. We as believers wrestle with this, that even sometimes we're not aware of our commitments. On that kind of underlying level, we don't see the way that our commitments are motivating necessarily our behavior. That sometimes we hold to things, we act in certain ways that we don't even clearly understand. That we, in our conscious self, in the consciousness of action, we at times evaluate and find, oh yeah, I actually have, based on the way I'm acting, practically, I have bought into that. I have bought into that underlying presupposition or assumption about life, even though I wasn't aware of it. That's been the way that I've functioned in the cultural context where I live. That happens to us, as I've said, as believers, and something we need to be on guard against. And so that's a concept that Wilkins and Sanford particularly focus their attention on. So these presuppositions then that Sire talks about are something that we sometimes hold to consistently, sometimes inconsistently, but they do provide information for us about the basic constitution of our world, of our reality. They help us to understand reality, and they are foundations that we build on as we act in life. Now, as we think of worldview as a story, it's important for us to consider, to remind ourselves that worldviews they're not static. They're not static systems that get created once for all necessarily, that they're in flux in a sense, in creative process, that not necessarily our core commitments are in flux, although core commitments do and can change. That's part of our premise, in fact, in presenting these materials overall, that worldviews can and do change, but certainly they change in smaller ways as our stories in life move forward. For example, my son's story as an 8 or 10-year-old nowadays would be founded on certainly some of the same presuppositions that I as an adult hold to in Christian theism, because we've been teaching those things to him. But obviously there's a lot of room for growing, changing, expanding that's going to occur in the course of his story playing out as he grows into his adult years. That my story personally isn't the same today as it was 10 years ago. That I'm a maturing and changing person, seeing change introduced into my worldview. And so our stories, just to keep in mind that our stories are changing, they're growing, they're expanding. And that makes worldview as a process, as an idea, somewhat messy. And life is messy, isn't it? We can't control the messiness of life. we can nonetheless describe a set of presuppositions, as we've said, that we are holding to at a heart level that do provide a foundation for our reality. So we're trying to identify those core commitments, those core presuppositional statements. And then James Sire goes on to mention here that worldviews can be described as absorbed sometimes rather than adopted. That in reality, enculturation as a process puts us in a place where lots of the components of our worldviews are indeed absorbed from our natures in a sense as human beings, but just as importantly, or maybe more so, from the nurture of those who are our influences in our lives. That we absorb what's described and defined from our social environments and from our physical environments. It's not as if we as human beings, in the course of enculturation from the time we're children to adults, that we've thought our way into our worldview. That's not the way it tends to work. That we've logically stood back in some sort of objective place and compared all the systems and decided on one. That's not how worldview formation works for people. The worldviews that we hold to, by and large, are formed by what we would expect by their social and physical circumstances. In many of the worldview contexts where we propose to work, those worldviews are not even formally defined. The things that we're talking about in worldview today, that we don't see that formal set of presuppositions explicated by people. But they are generated even sometimes, as Sire intimates, in bits and pieces. And those are ideas that we're not going to look at in this tutorial, but in the next one. And also, we're headed then towards, from this definition, towards a set of specific questions that we trust will help to guide us in identifying and evaluating the worldviews that we hold to and that others hold to around us.